Lynch's work has always been surrounded with mystery and those trying to solve its mysteries. He's a deliberately coy filmmaker and is notorious for not explaining the meaning behind his work, except that one Lost Highway interview. Twin Peaks is no different. From its run in the 90s to its return in 2017, the show has always been surrounded by intrigue. For a world over 30 years old, its audience are still controversially looking for answers. There are those that will tell you what they think it's definitively about, and there are those that will tell you to just feel it. Yet at the end of the day, nothing ever adds up to a complete picture. It's a consequence of Lynch's directorial style, and while some people find it frustrating, his abstract approach to film has always captivated me. After all, Lynch is a painter, not a filmmaker. However, with all art, whether it be paintings, runway, architecture, music or film, the artist will always create from context. We're human beings and our thoughts and feelings are governed by the experiences around us. From Lynch's first feature film Eraserhead to his overwhelmingly magnum opus The Return, Lynch has always explored ideas and motifs close to his life, and more widely his journey through America as a young man and the darkness that he saw in it following World War II. Born 1 year after the war ended, Lynch grew up in post-war America, and his films have always explored the underbelly of violence that it left behind. Whilst Twin Peaks started early in his career and finished quite late in his current filmography, it's always stood out to me as his true work as an auteur. His truly horrifying exploration of the violence in post-war America and the inescapable trauma it caused small towns. It explored everything Lynch had to offer on the subject and did so through the lens of a new medium to Lynch: television. Having grown up with soaps like Dynasty and Peyton Place, Lynch's offering to the world of television was as much a doppelganger of existing TV shows as it was its own thing. Its original run deliberately played around with convention,
Tibet,
mirroring and displacing typical tropes of the time in a commentary on the medium of soap TV. For the record, Twin Peaks isn't just about TV, as a certain someone out there would beg you to believe. It's a show about life, the guiding forces of human nature, and an exploration of the eternal fight between good and evil. Yet, for all the grand themes spanning from environmentalism to Jungian psychology, it is a reflection of the art and media around it.
Tibet.
Art is sort of a decentralized collective thing. Like art is kind of a conversation with all the artists that have ever lived before you. You know, like it's like you're really just sort of, it's not like anyone's reinventing the wheel here. Like you're kind of just taking, you know, thousands of years of art and like running it through your own little algorithm and then like making your interpretation of it.
It's an inevitable part of the process. Writing is informed by your experiences, and when it comes to film and TV, it's informed by the shows and films you've watched. Just as Twin Peaks originally examined and defied television tropes in the 90s, it's safe to say The Return overtly manipulates audiences' expectations following the golden age of TV, and specifically the new age drama ushered in by HBO. Just as Twin Peaks was a reflection of the American 90s era soaps, The Return was informed by the golden age of TV, and specifically complicated stories that define the great American story as the inner struggle for men to control their wildest desires. They're stories about teachers becoming drug barons, advertisers struggling to control their addictions, mob bosses who can't balance their family life, and family men who can't stop murdering people. They are Jekyll and Hyde, explorations of objectively bad men, and fantasy watching for the middle-aged men of America. After fans' outrage at the lack of Dale Cooper in Fire Walk with Me, it's certain to say that Lynch knew of the desire to see his overwhelmingly charismatic lead return to the screen. And Lynch did what he always does: he said no. During the 25 years of Dale Cooper drinking coffee in the Black Lodge, Lynch had witnessed a new age of television, one that was wildly different to the one-dimensional and frequently misogynistic soaps of the 90s. Except they weren't different, they were still misogynistic, they just defended it by making their male leads complicated, so the viewer at home could still indulge in the fantasy of being an asshole, from the safety of, but he's a teacher, and he's doing it for his family. In the midst of shows that focused on the conflict and evil of individuals, and specifically male individuals, Lynch took a stab at America as an entity. Once a small town called Twin Peaks in the 90s, now a globalized modern America in 2017. No longer the evils of fathers hiding behind white picket fences, but the evils of the hydrogen bomb, corporatism, the oil industries, the destruction of the environment, and the culling of Native Americans. The fundamental pillars that America itself stands on: genocide, corporatism, and military violence. A country that preaches freedom of speech but invades countries and burns women and children over political beliefs that don't match theirs. A country built on the idea of individuality and liberty, but has slowly morphed into a mindless corporate vessel where coffee is no longer a lovingly warm and open mug, but a closed void cardboard takeout cup. Individuality is gone, complicated male leads are in, and Lynch so brutally welcomes us to the return. The return wasn't just the return of Twin Peaks, but the return of Dale Cooper. A once overt play on what a leading man should be no longer fit in with what TV had become. There was another thread too. With morphing entertainment houses such as Disney, legacy content has become insatiably marketable. I don't know how Lynch saw the early through lines, but he did, and the criticism in the return couldn't be more scathing. Fans want nostalgia, and Disney knows it can buy and sell their heroes back to them. Just like fans want their Kenobi back no matter the cost of quality, Twin Peaks fans wanted their Dale Cooper back, and Lynch refused to give it to them. Beginning the show with its original beloved theme song, Lynch chooses to throw us straight back in with Dale Cooper, stuck somewhere quiet, old and scared. Within a second of its first scene, we, the audience, know Cooper has aged. He's different. It feels different. It's been 25 years and Lynch looks at him through a black and white lens. He doesn't belong. A time gone and a world no longer with us before Lynch cuts to Jacoby. He sits and unwraps a shovel wrapped in plastic. It's almost as if the first show started with something wrapped in plastic. Except this time it's a cold, metal, lifeless object, something you dig old treasures out with or bury them, depending on what's needed. Jacoby spray paints them gold and he sells them back to his viewers. It's way too close to comfort considering everything that would happen in the entertainment industry following 2017, and establishes Lynch in my mind as one of the greatest visionaries of all time. Lynch didn't want to bring Twin Peaks back on the fans' terms. They didn't own the world, and like Aeneas in Homer's epic The Odyssey, or Nostos, to return, we must be humble and patient. The world has moved on from Laura Palmer, the case files are buried, and as we wait for old friends to begrudgingly dig them out, we must observe what has come to be. So, in the face of changing television and the fans' desire for Dale Cooper to return, what does Lynch do? How does he reflect those changing values in his leading man? What is so enticing about the complicated male leads in dramas like Breaking Bad and Mad Men? The excuse. The ability to explore the depravity of immoral behaviour by making them complicated. He's not really an insecure and emotionally malnourished man who turns to murdering and drug production to feel powerful. He's a family man whose desires are to leave a support network behind when he dies. Don't get me wrong, I love Breaking Bad, and I think the teleplay is much more complicated and nuanced than that, but it does substantiate the great American story and falls into all the same traps that the other Golden Age TV does, giving men a frighteningly vulgar escape into the fantasy of male power and domination. Enter Mr. C. Mr. C doesn't need anything. Mr. C wants. Evil Cooper is the darkness, the selfishness, the unadulterated evil and toxic masculinity of modern leading men. He murders without remorse, he takes what he wants regardless of the consequences, and when confronted with his actions, he doesn't give an excuse. Mr. C doesn't need anything, Mr. C wants. He's a man that always resorts to physical violence to solve his issues. He's an America that refuses to have a dialogue, instead opting for violence and confrontation. Yet for all his brutality and aggression, what does it all boil down to? A child's game. When arriving at the cartel's Montana base for Ray, Mr. C arm wrestles its leader for control of the gang and control of Ray. An ungodly powerful being of evil energy must arm wrestle because that's all violence and confrontation is, a silly playground game between boys. Ostensibly, Mr. C is quite an obtuse exploration of the darkest depths of our modern leading men, but under the surface, his violent lack of an excuse for his behaviour and unbridled comfort in his aggression is what makes us, the audience, uncomfortable. It's unbelievably effective because it's so simple. Take the violence of our favourite leading men in the physical form of our favourite leading man and take away his excuse. Make him want it instead of pretending to not want it, and suddenly we squirm. The audience's feelings of loathing towards Mr. C is only exaggerated by the other two personas Lynch splits Cooper into. Lodge Cooper, the most recognisable and narratively close to Cooper, seems to have space and time bent backwards for him, as if the universe itself is assisting in his rescue from the Black Lodge, back into our hands. The audience is willing to accept any number of ludicrous plot conveniences for us to simply have our Cooper back. It works, he leaves, except Lynch tricks us and Dougie Jones enters the return. Dougie Jones is arguably, and bear with me here, the most complicated character in the return. I'm going to talk more about Dougie and how Lynch explores modern America and the middle class through him later, but it's important to establish Dougie as a subversion here. He, as I'm sure everyone agrees, is both immensely adorable and excruciatingly frustrating. By trapping Cooper in an almost fetal state, Lynch completely destroys any preconceptions of our hero. It makes Cooper a literal child in the face of the Black Lodge and in turn reflects the infantile behaviour of our other Golden Age leads, leaving his wife Janie completely responsible for holding the family unit together. Does that sound familiar? Dougie represents an America that is run by family-orientated mothers holding together their homes as their infantile husbands run off chasing the great American story of masculinity. It's an extremely feminist message and an even extremer reflection at that, but then again, Lynch isn't new to either of those things. Dougie is a healthy exploration of what it means to be a modern man in America, or more critically, how the leading men of our TV shows are no longer balanced, but infants running around on their ego trips perpetrating violence. It's okay though, we love him because he stuck a fork in a plug socket. It's not his fault, he's got an excuse. Like I said, I'll get back around to Dougie, but at this juncture I want to stop to talk about the overarching feminist themes in Twin Peaks and how Lynch explores women in modern America and the Golden Age. The Return is about many things, but most importantly it's about women. In fact, Fire Walk with Me was about women, and dare I say it, Twin Peaks was about women. I love Cooper, we all do. He's one of the best male leads of all time and a genuinely good role model. But ultimately, one of the major themes Lynch explores throughout the entire show that's nestled into his exploration of America itself is women. How women are treated, how women are viewed, and how female leads in TV shows perpetrate that cycle of violence. If Fire Walk with Me gave America's dead girl a voice, The Return gives America's dead girl a new life. A life separate to the raging desire to constantly drag her trauma around in a sad attempt to keep the show alive. The Return's ending is much more nuanced than Laura just being given a separate life away from Twin Peaks, and I'll come to that later, but tied up in that ending certainly is the idea that Laura herself has moved on, and so should the fans. It's common knowledge that Ashley Judd's casting as Ben Horn's assistant speaks volumes about Lynch's use of female characters in The Return. Being one of the first actresses to speak out against Harvey Weinstein, giving her a returning role in Twin Peaks as Ben Horn's assistant, a once sleazy, woman-abusing male authority figure, is nothing short of brilliance. What does Lynch do when the two of them must become intimate through TV convention? He doesn't reward Ben Horn's good years with a much younger female trophy. He makes Ben say no. Ben doesn't deserve her, and that's why he's been good all these years. To have their relationship develop into an intimate romance would counterserve the entire purpose of what the character is striving to achieve, and would in turn perpetuate the idea that good men deserve women regardless of their previous crimes or age. They simply deserve them because they're being good. Women find themselves consistently at the behest of their infantile counterparts throughout The Return. Professional working women will still find themselves having to run errands and take men to the little boys' room. Working mothers still have to run the entire family unit by themselves, and young girls are still being taken advantage of by their drug-addled boyfriends. America has changed and women have gotten a voice, but for all the social voice they have up and down the country, the dynamic really hasn't progressed that much, and society still has a long way to come for equality in both Twin Peaks and modern America. Like women, America still has a long way to come in terms of its violent culture for Lynch. One of the show's most idiosyncratic moments is Richard's hit and run. It's so hyper-real that it almost feels staged, fake and out of tone with the rest of the show. Surrounded by extremely normal extras, the staged murder plays out as a take on violence in broad daylight and the inability of the American public to react to it. Gone are the murders committed deep within the woods, 25 years have passed, and the violence in America has boiled over to the surface of the pot. It's no longer squirreled away in homes undisturbed. The internet exists, and we live in an ever-watchful era. Lynch chooses the most hyper-normal extras he could, and just makes them all stand there. It's so uncanny it almost feels like a fake scene. There's no pretense to it, no showmanship, no style. It's simply the American public bearing witness to the horrors of society with no ability to change it. Violence 25 years later is men shooting at people for blocking their driveway, kids finding guns in their parents' car and accidentally firing them. Shelley and Bobby hid their affair away, but Shelley's daughter and her boyfriend do cocaine in broad daylight by the trash cans of the Double R. Times have changed, and with it the visibility of violence too. Our media and our lives are being touched by violence in ways that the original Twin Peaks wasn't, and the return reflects that in all its horrendous darkness. Dougie is complicated. Whilst he's an extension of Lynch's exploration of how we interact with legacy characters and an almost cat and mouse-like game he plays with the audience, he's also a vessel through which Lynch can explore the major commercial themes of American society. He, like so many others, is a corporate drone, an exaggerated and perplexing vision of the corporate man, an empty vessel through which business can operate. He glides about his working life, performing menial and incorrect work for the sake of work. He, like so many Americans, is the figurehead of a family burdened by debt, more specifically by gambling, a Lynchian dystopia of the burden of the commercial dream. Money controls them and also sets them free. Dougie's household is the quintessential middle-class American family, except it's not a happy family. It's a family found struggling with the woes of money and the burden of a male figurehead that can't control himself. Only when Dougie, who is now inhabited by Cooper, shuts up and lets the world around him quarrel and bicker does he find peace. A pathway through the corporate world, a pathway through his marriage, and a pathway through his hardships. In a world governed by voices and individual wants, one man being quiet is enough to start a pathway towards happiness, which is kind of a beautiful message. However, on the opposite side of that argument, there are many elements of Kafka's literary work that's nestled into The Return, but one of the most interesting is Lynch's take on his novel The Metamorphosis, an absurdly surrealist story about a travelling salesman called Gregor that wakes up one morning as a helpless bug, finds a reflection in Cooper's waking up as Dougie Jones. Except whilst Kafka's tale is about the fallout of family backs turning on a financially unhelpful Gregor, Lynch's modern interpretation is almost more unsavoury. Instead of Gregor being unable to provide and thus becoming hated, Dougie's inaction is rewarded by society and his family. His inability to be is the perfect cog for the corporate machine. His blank state is all that is required, a vessel through which work can be obtained. No complaints, no ability to defend himself, just a harmless cog in the machine. It's an interesting twist on Kafka's story and certainly highlights Lynch's feelings about corporate America, but I think Lynch's main takeaway from Kafka's work is a more beautiful and hopeful message I will talk about at the curtain call. Like Lynch's exploration of Kafka's work, Lynch examines his own personal relationship with art through the show. Gordon Cole, the previous director of the FBI, played by Lynch himself, is an oddball within the world of The Return. Like Cooper, he doesn't utilize just logic to reach his conclusions, and is ever aware of his dreams. All in all, Cole plays as a direct reflection of how Lynch builds his stories, biting at idea by idea until the full picture is revealed. I talked about how I believe Mulholland Drive is the quintessential representation of how Lynch approaches his work as a painter, but The Return analyzes the brushstroke by brushstroke mythology. Famously, Lynch wrote Inland Empire whilst shooting, as the ideas came to him, and in the return, Cole is consistently left in the dark. He thrives in not understanding what he's working towards, but taking small ideas as they come. Like how Cole explains the potential of the double Cooper in the plane with his hands, Cole, like Lynch, also thrives on symbolism. It's a unique character to put into the storm of the show, but I think it calls to the attention of the audience that even Lynch is lost within this world. The themes and ideas are so large and complicated at this point that, like Lynch, it's okay to feel overwhelmed and in the dark at times. The more that comes to you, the more you will understand, but Twin Peaks is such a behemoth of a concept, you will never see the whole picture at once, only the brushstrokes. The Return is ultimately one of the most complicated pieces of film literacy I've ever seen. It's a long, dark road of script that's only illuminated at the corners. Miles and miles are taken hurtling into the darkness until a corner approaches and you regain a sense of location. Through that misty journey, Lynch manages to recontextualize a 25-year-old show and reflect the way the world has changed, from American society as a whole to the continuing violence on women and the surface of America. Lynch explores the dark belly of America in much more detail than I could afford to talk about here, but through all of these dark motifs, one thing stands brightly uncertain: the curtain call. The two-part ending to the show that has widely been considered a left-right hook from Lynch, with part 17 giving the audience our modern television ending, in which the bad guy is defeated. Lynch beautifully subverts it by showing the audience the true reality of such an ending, and how silly the concept of fighting Bob and winning is. Placing Bob inside a giant black ball and having a man punch him to death is both hilarious and genius writing all at once. As Cooper watches on, his face imprinted onto the screen, we and Cooper come to realize that this is not the outcome we could ever have. The story of Twin Peaks is much more complicated than that, and you can't just beat evil with violence. Cooper, like the audience, bends time and space to try to save Laura, and ultimately fails. A bleak hour of Cooper relentlessly trying to force his narrative onto another girl ends with one brutal question. Not only is Cooper confused by the year in the show's timeline, but more prominently, he's confused as to why everyone in real life has moved on. The world has changed, and the world has forgotten Laura Palmer. It's no longer the 90s, and the desire to save Laura is no longer as strong as it once was. We and her have moved on from the character. And when Cooper realizes that in his fantastical and genius plane of thinking, he realizes the only question left to ask both the audience and the characters of the show is, what year is this? Cooper doesn't save Laura, but as Kafka's stories showed the world, failure wasn't an inherently bad thing. To fail is to try, and for Lynch, trying is all that matters. Evil will always exist in the world through small towns and big cities, from Big Pharma to the oil industry. We can't stop it existing, but we can fight it. Cooper failed to save Laura, but to fail is to try. And as long as there are good people, like Special Agent Dale Cooper, fighting for good, then the world has a fighting chance.